The brutal reality of Viking raids: blood, fire, and terror. The monastery bell tolls its final prayer as dawn breaks over Lindisfarne, June 8, 793 AD. The monks kneel in their stone halls, unaware that death sails toward them on the morning tide. Longships cut through the mist like hunting wolves, their dragon heads carved to strike terror into the hearts of the faithful. Today, the world will learn a new word for nightmare. Today, the Viking Age begins. For 3 centuries, these words would echo across every coastline in Europe, from the fury of the Northmen, "O Lord, deliver us." But no prayer would save them, no wall would hold them back, and no mercy would be shown. The storm from the north picture England in the year 793, a land of gentle rolling hills where Christian monks have known nothing but peace for generations. Their monasteries gleam white against green fields, filled with gold crosses, illuminated manuscripts, and the soft chanting of evening prayers. These holy men believe their God protects them. They are about to learn how wrong they are. The Vikings don't announce their arrival. They emerge from the sea fog like demons made flesh, their ships designed for one purpose: to strike without warning and vanish before retaliation can follow. Shallow drafted longships that can sail up rivers no other vessel can navigate. Sleek predators capable of carrying 30 blood-hungry warriors across the North Sea in conditions that would destroy any other craft. At Lindisfarne, the first monks to spot the approaching fleet likely mistake them for traitors. By the time they realize their error, it's far too late. The Vikings beach their ships and pour onto the sacred island like a tide of death. What happens next will be burned into European memory for 1,000 years. They don't just kill, they desecrate. They don't just raid, they terrorize. The monastery's treasures, golden chalices, silver crosses, jeweled manuscripts created by generations of devoted scribes, are torn from their sacred places and stuffed into sea chests. But the real horror isn't the theft, it's what they do to the people. Monks are dragged from their cells and butchered in their own chapels. Some are bound and thrown into the sea to drown. Others are hacked apart on the very altars where they once celebrated Mass. The lucky ones die quickly. The unlucky ones, their screams carry across the water for hours. Masters of terror. But Lindisfarne is just the beginning. A test run. A message sent in blood and smoke that announces the arrival of something Europe has never seen before. Warriors who fight not for land or politics, but for the pure, intoxicating rush of violence and plunder. The Vikings understand something that their victims do not. Terror is a weapon more powerful than any sword. They don't simply raid for treasure. They craft their attacks to create maximum psychological impact, to spread stories that will paralyze entire regions with fear. Consider their tactics. They strike during religious festivals when communities gather in celebration, turning joy into massacre. They target monasteries not just for their wealth, but because destroying these symbols of faith breaks something fundamental in the Christian psyche. They leave survivors specifically to spread word of their brutality, knowing that fear travels faster than their longships. Their weapons aren't just axes and swords, they're terror made manifest. Viking berserkers work themselves into trances before battle, consuming alcohol and possibly hallucinogenic mushrooms until they believe they've become bears or wolves. They charge into combat howling like animals, foam streaming from their mouths, feeling no pain, showing no mercy. To face a berserker in battle is to confront something that seems barely human, and when the killing is done, they don't simply retreat, they burn everything. Churches, homes, entire settlements vanish in columns of black smoke that can be seen for miles. The message is clear. This is what happens to those who resist. This is what awaits anyone who stands in their path. Rivers of blood. By the early 800s, Viking raids have evolved from sporadic attacks into systematic campaigns of destruction. They've learned the geography of Christian Europe intimately, mapping every river, every coastline, every wealthy target. Their raids follow the seasons like migrations of death. Spring brings the first longships. Summer sees massive fleets, sometimes hundreds of vessels carrying thousands of warriors, descending on major cities. Paris is besieged repeatedly, its citizens cowering behind walls while Vikings camp outside their gates for months, demanding ransom just to leave. When the payment doesn't come fast enough, they burn the surrounding countryside until the very air tastes of ash. Ireland suffers particularly brutal treatment. Viking armies establish permanent bases there, launching raids deeper into the countryside each year. They don't just take treasure, they take people. Thousands upon thousands are dragged from their homes in chains, destined for slave markets from Dublin to Constantinople. Children are torn from their mothers' arms. Wives are separated from husbands. Entire bloodlines vanish into bondage. The psychological warfare is deliberate and calculated. Vikings know that broken spirits are easier to control than broken bones. They perfect techniques designed to shatter the will to resist. They force fathers to watch their daughters violated. They make sons dig graves for their own parents. They turn communities against each other by sparing some while slaughtering others, seemingly at random. The great heathen army. But individual raids, no matter how devastating, are nothing compared to what comes next. In 865 AD, something unprecedented arrives on English shores. The great heathen army. This isn't a raiding party. This is an invasion force. Thousands of Viking warriors united under war leaders like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Their goal isn't mere plunder. It's conquest. Total, absolute conquest of Anglo-Saxon England. They land in East Anglia and begin a campaign of destruction so methodical, so comprehensive, that entire kingdoms simply cease to exist. This is warfare stripped of all pretense, reduced to its most primal elements. Kill, burn, take, repeat. King Edmund of East Anglia meets them in battle and suffers a fate that becomes legend and nightmare. Captured alive, he's tied to a tree and used for archery practice by Viking warriors. They shoot arrows into him one by one, slowly, while he's still breathing. When they tire of the sport, they behead him and throw his head into the woods. The message to other English kings is unmistakable. This is what resistance earns you. York falls after a siege that turns the ancient Roman city into a charnel house. The Vikings breach the walls and pour through the streets like a human flood. They kill indiscriminately. Soldiers, civilians, clergy, children. The city's churches become slaughterhouses. The River Ouse runs red with blood for days afterward. Nottingham is next, then Reading. Each victory makes them stronger. Each defeat makes their enemies weaker. The great heathen army doesn't just conquer territory, it erases civilizations. Where once stood prosperous Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with centuries of history, now there's only smoking ruins and Viking overlords counting their loot. The Blood Eagle. Among all the horrors perpetrated by Viking raiders, one stands above the rest in its calculated cruelty. The Blood Eagle. This isn't simply execution. It's ritualized torture designed to honor their gods while sending an unmistakable message to their enemies. The victim, always someone of high status, a king or noble who has particularly offended the Vikings, is laid face down. His ribs are cut away from his spine with an axe, one by one, while he's still alive. The broken ribs are then pulled outward and upward to form the shape of wings. Finally, his lungs are pulled out through the wounds and spread across his back like the feathers of an eagle. If the victim can endure this without screaming, Viking belief holds that he'll earn entry to Valhalla, despite being their enemy. Most don't manage it. The fortunate ones pass out from shock before the worst begins. The unfortunate ones remain conscious throughout the entire ordeal, their screams echoing across whatever settlement has been chosen to witness this display of Viking power. King Ella of Northumbria allegedly suffers this fate at the hands of Ivar the Boneless. Revenge for Ella's supposed murder of Ivar's father, Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether the historical Ella actually died this way remains debated by scholars. But the fact that Vikings spread stories of the Blood Eagle, that they wanted people to believe they were capable of such methodical brutality, tells us everything we need to know about their approach to psychological warfare. The long winter of fear. For over 2 centuries, Europe lives under a shadow. No coastal settlement is safe. No monastery is sacred. No kingdom is strong enough to guarantee protection. Viking raids become as predictable as the changing seasons, and just as unstoppable. Children grow up knowing that any strange sail on the horizon might bring death. Parents teach their sons and daughters to recognize the distinctive profile of Viking longships while they're still learning to walk. Entire generations know no peace, only the constant gnawing fear that tomorrow might bring the sound of war horns and the sight of dragon-prowed ships cutting through morning mist. The psychological toll is immeasurable. Chroniclers of the time write of people who refuse to live near coastlines, of farmers who abandon fertile river valleys because they're too accessible to Viking raiders. Trade routes that have operated for centuries are abandoned as too dangerous. Cultural exchanges that once enriched European civilization grind to a halt because nobody dares travel far from fortified settlements. Churches begin incorporating prayers specifically for protection from Viking raids into their regular services. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us, becomes as common as the Lord's Prayer. Parents tell their children stories of saints who supposedly protected villages from Viking attacks, desperate to give them some sense that divine intervention might save them where human strength has failed. But for every story of miraculous deliverance, there are 10 more of communities that prayed just as fervently and burned just as completely. The price of resistance. Those who choose to fight back quickly learn that resistance only brings worse suffering. The Vikings don't just defeat armies. They make examples of those who dare oppose them. When the Franks attempt to fortify their coastal settlements, Vikings simply sail upriver and attack from unexpected directions. When the English try to build a network of burhs, fortified towns designed to provide mutual defense, Vikings adapt by striking at the roads between settlements, cutting off supply lines and communications. Alfred the Great manages to halt Viking expansion in England, but only after decades of devastating warfare that leaves vast swaths of the country depopulated. Even his victories come at tremendous cost. The Battle of Edington may save Anglo-Saxon England, but it follows years of campaigns where entire armies are slaughtered and whole kingdoms vanish from the map. In Ireland, the situation grows even worse. Viking settlements like Dublin become permanent bases for slave raids that penetrate deep into the countryside. Irish kings who attempt to unite against the Norse invaders find themselves fighting on multiple fronts as Vikings forge alliances with rival Irish clans, turning the island's traditional political divisions against itself. The psychological warfare continues even after major military defeats. Vikings who've been driven from one region simply sail to another, carrying with them detailed knowledge of their former enemies' weaknesses. They spread stories of how easily supposedly mighty kingdoms fell to their axes. They describe in vivid detail what happened to the last group of warriors who thought they could stand against Norse fury. The last of the Storm Kings. By the late 10th century, the great age of Viking expansion begins to wane. The kingdoms of Europe have adapted, building stronger defenses and learning to fight with Viking tactics. Christianity has reached Scandinavia itself, slowly transforming the very culture that produced these maritime predators. But the end doesn't come all at once. It arrives in waves, like the tide receding after a great storm. The last major Viking raids are led by men like King Magnus Barefoot of Norway and Harald Hardrada, warriors who remember the old ways and refuse to accept that their age of dominance is ending. Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking kings, embodies everything terrifying about Norse military culture. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, scarred from a lifetime of warfare stretching from Russia to the Mediterranean, he's known throughout Europe as the Thunderbolt of the North. His very name sends shivers through royal courts from England to Byzantium. When he lands in Yorkshire in 1066 with a massive invasion fleet, it seems like the old nightmare is beginning again. The English army that meets him at Stamford Bridge expects to face another generation of Viking terror. Instead, they discover something unexpected. The Storm Kings can bleed. They can die. They can be defeated. Harald Hardrada falls at Stamford Bridge, struck down by an English arrow. With him dies something more than just a king, the last great champion of the old Viking way of life. The age of dragon ships and blood eagles is ending, not with a dramatic final battle, but with the quiet recognition that the world has changed and left the Vikings behind. Echoes in stone and memory. Today, if you walk through the ruins of medieval monasteries across Britain and Ireland, you can still see the scars. Stones blackened by fires set over 1,000 years ago. Foundation walls that were rebuilt again and again after Viking raids. Empty spaces where once stood churches that were burned so thoroughly that later generations never bothered to rebuild them. In Iceland, archaeologists uncover Viking longhouses with rooms specifically designed for processing slaves, sorting them, holding them, preparing them for transport to markets across the known world. The floors of these rooms are stained dark with substances that modern science can identify, but that common decency hesitates to name. Genetic studies reveal the true scope of Viking expansion and its human cost. DNA analysis of modern European populations shows the distinctive markers of Scandinavian ancestry scattered across the continent, testimony to raids and conquests that mixed Viking blood with that of their victims through generations of violence and captivity. But perhaps the most haunting evidence isn't physical at all. It's cultural. The deep, persistent fear of seaborne invasion that permeates European consciousness for centuries after the last Viking longship returns to port. The way coastal communities continue to build their churches and important buildings inland, away from the water, long after there's any rational reason to fear Norse raiders. The English language itself bears scars from those 3 centuries of terror. Words like berserk, slaughter, and ransack come directly from Old Norse, linguistic fossils of a time when Viking vocabulary was learned at sword point. Every time we use these words, we're unconsciously echoing the voices of raiders who measured success in blood and gold. The verdict of history. Modern scholarship has worked hard to present a more balanced view of Viking culture, emphasizing their achievements as traders, explorers, and craftsmen. They were skilled metalworkers, accomplished poets, and daring navigators who reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. Their democratic assemblies and legal codes were remarkably advanced for their time. All of this is true, but it doesn't erase the other truth, that for 3 centuries, the sight of Viking sails on the horizon was a harbinger of death for countless thousands of innocent people, that their expansion was built on a foundation of systematic terrorism, slave-taking, and cultural destruction that left scars across an entire continent. The monks of Lindisfarne were learned men, scholars who preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages. The manuscripts they created were masterpieces of medieval art. The communities they served were centers of education and spiritual development. In a single day, Viking raiders destroyed centuries of accumulated wisdom and beauty, and they did it not for any grand political purpose, but simply because these things were valuable and defenseless. This is the true legacy of the Viking raids, not the romantic image of noble warriors seeking glory, but the harsh reality of predators who discovered that civilization's strength was also its weakness, that the very qualities that made medieval society beautiful, its trust, its openness, its dedication to higher purposes than mere survival, also made it vulnerable to those who recognized no law but force. The price of memory. We remember the Vikings today largely through the lens of popular culture that emphasizes their adventurous spirit and martial prowess. Television shows and movies present them as complex anti-heroes, rebels against corrupt systems, or noble savages living closer to nature than their civilized victims. But this modern romanticization comes at a cost. It asks us to forget the voices of those who suffered under Viking axes. It minimizes the trauma of communities that were literally erased from existence. It treats systematic terrorism and mass enslavement as colorful details in an exciting historical adventure story. The truth is both more complex and more disturbing. The Vikings were neither mythical monsters nor misunderstood heroes. They were human beings who created a culture that celebrated violence as the highest virtue and measured a man's worth by his ability to take what he wanted from those weaker than himself. They were the products of a harsh environment and a warrior tradition that valued strength above all else. But they were also the architects of systematic campaigns of terror that traumatized an entire continent. They pioneered techniques of psychological warfare that deliberately targeted civilians and cultural symbols to maximize the spread of fear. They built an economy based on human trafficking that treated people as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded across international markets. Understanding this doesn't require us to demonize them any more than understanding the brutality of other historical periods requires us to demonize their participants. It simply requires us to remember that history's most dramatic figures often achieved their fame through actions that caused immense suffering to ordinary people whose names we'll never know. The farmers who fled their fields when Viking sails appeared on the horizon. The children who were dragged away from their families and sold into slavery. The monks who died defending manuscripts they'd spent their lives creating. The mothers who watched their sons march off to fight raiders and never returned. These people deserve to be remembered too, not as faceless victims in someone else's saga, but as human beings whose lives and deaths mattered just as much as those of the warriors who destroyed them. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson the Viking Age teaches us, that civilization is both stronger and more fragile than we imagine. Stronger because it can survive centuries of systematic assault and eventually absorb even its most violent enemies. More fragile because all our achievements, our art, our learning, our institutions, our very humanity, can be swept away in a single morning by those who value nothing but their own power. The dragon ships are gone now. rotted to splinters in harbors whose names we've forgotten. But the capacity for both creation and destruction that they represented remains part of the human condition, waiting in the midst of an uncertain future, like longships cutting through the dawn toward some unsuspecting shore.